Okay, so now moving on to the last session of this place, the multipurpose hall. The next topic of discussion is military museums and heritage conservation. I would like to invite Dr. Peter Johnston, who's Director Narrative and Content, Imperial War Museum. Julian Ferrance from National Army Museum, United Kingdoms. Professor Raman D. Suri, Architect and Urban Planner, and Dr. Kanika Singh, who's Director, Center for Writing and Communication, Ashoka University. I'll invite them on the stage, please. So this panel discussion revolves around the role of military museums, which play a pivotal role in the preservation of India's rich military heritage. These institutions act as bridge between the public and historical narratives, which are instrumental in shaping our nation's collective memory and identity in the world, on the world stage. Our esteemed panelists, experts of leading institutions, shall explore the evolving significance of military museums and how they contribute to our understanding of military history on a global scale. Over to you, Dr. Kanika.
Thank you very much. A very warm welcome to my fellow panelists to this session on military museums and heritage conservation, and also to the audience. I see some fellow historians and who were very interested in the previous session. We are expecting an equally enthusiastic participation in this one. Yeah. There will be some time for an interaction with the audience as well. And a large part of this session is a discussion on the key themes, challenges, areas of interest in military museums and heritage conservations. But first, we'll begin the session by a presentation by Professor Raman Suri. Please.
Kanika Singh, my colleagues on this panel, ladies and gentlemen. My talk today is about preserving the heritage of our armed forces. The approach I have taken in this subject is largely a conceptual one. To my mind, there are four basic questions. What is the meaning of heritage? Why should it be conserved? What constitutes the heritage of the Indian Armed Forces? And finally, how can we conserve it? To begin with, it should be pointed out that history is not heritage. Though closely related, the terms have different meanings. History is basically an account of what happened in the past, while heritage refers to what has survived from the past that we deem valuable today. It must therefore possess both the qualities of continuity and value. The values themselves can be of different kinds, such as evidential, historic, aesthetic, and communal. Heritage may be either tangible or intangible. The tangible kinds may be natural, such as rivers, forests, or man-made, such as buildings, artifacts, items, and objects of value. The intangible kind includes traditions, customs, rituals, ceremonies, social practices, festivals, and performing arts. We come to the next question. Why should it be conserved? It should be conserved because it is a valuable cultural resource. Our heritage is who we are, our identity, where we come from, our past, present, and future, all connecting in a powerful way. It reflects our aspirations and achievements. If we don't look after it, then obviously it will decline and diminish in value. The third question, what constitutes the heritage of the armed forces? Most tangible kinds can be seen in army cantonment areas. These include historic buildings, open spaces, old spatial structures or layout patterns. Then there are memorials, items of warfare, vehicles, machinery, artifacts, souvenirs, uniforms, documents and records, and various kinds of regimental heritage items. There are also forts and fortresses and war cemeteries. Likewise, there are aircrafts, ships, submarines, and other service-specific items. The intangible kinds include traditions and customs, ceremonial parades, music of army bands, equestrian and sporting events, and a host of traditional ceremonies and social functions. It is often not just the event itself that is significant, but the manner of conducting it that can be indicative of human virtues and values which remain invaluable to society at large and to the services in particular. In fact, I should think that a number of these customs would fall within the ambit of charters of UNESCO and other internationally renowned agencies, which define the scope and meaning of heritage customs worthy of worldwide conservation for posterity. In a civilization as old as ours, this heritage, especially the intangible kind, actually goes back many centuries. It extends from the period of the Mahabharata and beyond, several thousand years ago, through the Mauryan and Gupta period, medieval Indian, Sultanate and Mughal periods, the British colonial and princely states period, right to 1947 and after. And it draws from all major events that have transpired during these times. This takes us to the fourth and final question: how can this heritage be conserved? In short, it needs a bold policy and an overall framework for its conservation. While several individuals and institutions have done valuable conservation work, these efforts seem largely piecemeal. What is really required is a comprehensive framework for planning, development, and management of the history and heritage of our forces. Let us look at the existing situation for two items: official records and built form. In the case of official records, these are understood to be kept in multiple locations in different departments and organizations, such as the National Archives, MOD History Division, Navy and IAF History Divisions, and the concerned service headquarters. Some war histories have also been written by independent authors and are of a laudable quality and standard. Yet there seems to be a paucity of books and publications about heritage-specific themes or of thematically developed historical records. An overall planned system to properly identify, record, maintain, educate, research, and disseminate information about valuable historical items and traditions is highly desirable. Let us take another example, that of built heritage. Where buildings and sites are concerned, there is the ASI Act 2010, which applies at national level, and there are the corresponding state level acts. Apart from these, there is a provision to protect natural heritage, precincts, buildings, monuments, and artifacts under the Cantonments Act 2006. However, specific regulations to define and apply these provisions are lacking. At present, there is only a cursory mention of the requirements of heritage conservation in Chapter 4, Duties and Powers of Cantonment Boards. Further details on how to go about with this exercise need to be developed and provided. As regards war memorials, there are a number of these at different locations in the country. They are usually simple structures built by the forces to commemorate their fallen comrades. It is doubtful if they number more than about 200 in all. Their design, development, care, and maintenance needs due attention. Museums and memorials are important means to display our heritage to the visitors. However, the real issue remains how the heritage itself should be identified and conserved. For this purpose, it is suggested that a National Military Heritage Trust be created. One possibility is that such a trust functions under the overall guidance and control of the Chief of Integrated Defense Staff. The USI's Executive Council could act as its trustees. Its main function would be to record and to help maintain historic and heritage material. Appropriate legislation could be drawn up for this task. What is important are the objectives of such a trust. The following are proposed. A, development of criteria and a classification system for deciding which objects, items, and practices should be conserved. B, identification and documentation of the existing items and practices for inclusion in the classifications developed. C, powers to lease or purchase objects of art and artifacts of a heritage value to the forces. D, uniform guidelines for the conservation, preservation, and restoration of the listed items. E, education and training programs on history and heritage subjects to be conducted, along with research on contemporary practices in these fields. F, monitoring of conservation and maintenance programs of the listed articles and practices to ensure compliance with established standards. It is further suggested that in due course, a single central facility could be built or designated to house the foregoing essential functions of research, documentation, and archives, along with preservation, education, and display. Based on the foregoing objectives and the policies that are adopted, a comprehensive conservation development plan covering all types of military heritage could be prepared. I say development plan, not master plan, because to me, the master plan implies a fixed identity, whereas a development plan would be an ongoing process, a flexible process, as heritage is constantly being created and also recreated. This would help safeguard and maintain a valuable national resource that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start with a question on military museums. So there's a new definition of museums which I came out with, and after much debate, so there's been a lot of fighting and argumentation and trading of charges about what is a museum. I'll also read that definition out for the benefit of our audience members. My question to you both, Julian and Peter, is where do military museums see themselves, or how do they see themselves engaging with this definition? And this is the new definition which was released and officially accepted by ICOM. A museum is a not-for-profit, permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. Further, it is open to public, accessible, and inclusive. Museums foster diversity and sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities, offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing.
They sound great, don't they? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I actually quite like the definition of museums. I think it, for the one point, it sort of drills into the heart of what each individual museum's unique selling point is, which is its collection. Museums are repositories of memory. They draw their lifeblood, their value, and make their contribution and dictate their work around what's in that collection and how it's shaped. Now, collections aren't infallible. They are entirely subjective. They are built by the prejudices, the unconscious biases, the fads, the favoritisms of curators over decades. And I say that as a curator that does collecting. You know, I know who I am. And I think that, therefore, museums should always be subject to challenge and change. And I think that challenge and change can come outside of the museum. And that's the most healthy place to engage with. And I feel like that definition sort of encompasses that. What's interesting is when you think about military museums in that context, because there's always the subject of enjoyment and fun always comes up, you know. And we, you know, I've worked in other military museums. I work in a museum of war and conflict, which doesn't actually present itself as a military museum. We're a social museum. But the idea being, can you have fun in the war museum? And I would say yes, I believe you can. You can behave in an appropriate way, and as long as you're not being disrespectful, you can still create opportunities for fun and enjoyment, because fun and enjoyment enable further learning. And you have to think of it as a tool to achieve your overarching mission, rather than something that sits counter to what you're actually trying to do.
Well, I broadly agree with the definition. I think it works fine for larger national museums, definitely. I concur with a lot of what Peter has said as well. The issue comes when you deal with much smaller museums, and we at the National Army Museum also represent the UK's 145 regimental museums, and some of them are going to struggle to fulfil the criteria as is described, particularly, say, for instance, full public access. A number of the regimental museums that we deal with are sat behind the wire, so they are part of military establishments. And although they can definitely be accessible by the soldiers who are on those bases, and in many cases they are designed to support those soldiers, they're not readily accessible to the public. So again, the smaller ones will struggle. And I think to address some of the points that Professor Suri has made, that despite the fact that they're behind the wire, they are still of vital necessity to the broader military story of the UK. They hold important records, they hold important objects, and therefore they are of great importance to that national story. We at the National Army Museum sit in the centre of a hub that supports those museums in very much the same way that the USI sits in the centre of the same hub here in Delhi and supports the legacy centres and museums of the Indian Army. So that was a long-winded way of saying I broadly support it, but not entirely.
So in this, if I weave together the points made by Peter, Julian, and Professor Suri here, so representation of military tradition, military heritage in museums in particular, and its preservation, conservation, and its promotion as a knowledge, to share knowledge. Is there space for being inclusive? What is the space for participation of communities? It's one of the things, you said you are a social museum of war and conflict. Yeah? So what is the space for participation of communities? What is the space for ensuring that those who have been traditionally marginalized in the space are also included? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, please. Would you like to comment on this?
Okay.
So I think that there's obviously a challenge within that. I feel like actually with the ICOM definition of museums, these are not supposed to be necessarily things that are easy to do. They're things that museums should challenge themselves to do, with the understanding that it will take museums time to be able to accomplish this. And some things need to be part of the ongoing mission rather than anything you can sort of tick a box and say, yes, I've done that. And that's particularly true of things like participation, I think. Particularly with something like war and conflict. In the UK context in particular, there's such a tiny proportion of people in the UK now who have direct military experience. And much of what we present are things that happened a long time ago, in many cases a long way away from what people can see in their lives around them. However, at the same time, and I heard this expressed very eloquently by a colleague from Canada, the population of the UK has changed since the Imperial War Museum was founded in 1917. And therefore, we were always founded to be a museum where anybody could come and say, this thing I did, like here's something that connects my story or my lived experience to the history of conflict. Now, as society has changed, we need to change with it. We can't continue to occupy the same ground as we always did. And that means both in terms of the stories we tell, how we tell them, and where we tell them. So in many cases, what we need to do is give up our position of authority in some ways, almost as gatekeepers to this, and be bridge builders. And we need to identify the communities of interest who are marginalized, and we need to make space to actively invite them in. At times that is quite challenging because you have to build a lot of trust, because these groups have been marginalized and know that they've been marginalized, and therefore you can't assume they are going to want to work with you. So it's not a, snap your fingers and gather people in and it happens. It is definitely easier with some than others, but it's an incredibly rewarding process because, much as Professor Suri was saying, and even as the Chief of Event Staff was saying yesterday about what makes things iconic, what makes things iconic is not what museum curators like myself, like Julian, like many of the other curators we've seen here talk about. It's what people think about the things. You know, the fascinating talk we just had about the Red Fort and how people make that iconic because they see it and they hold it as part of their identity, not because someone tells them they should, but because they do. And I think that therefore, if you need to find these stories that aren't representing your collection, you need to find the people who are going to tell you what those objects and things are, and then you can capture the tangible and the intangible heritage that goes with it.
Same point, actually. See, a lot depends on how the museum is designed. Clearly, the museum is for everyone. The marginalized community need very much to see it and to understand what is displayed. But the designer also has to design in such a way that he takes into account the interests and the likely behavior of all the audiences. I mean, I understand it happened at the War Museum here in Delhi that a number of the audience would come over there in warm weather, and some of them were found playing in the water pools. So their interest was more in the facility which was offered by cooling off in water than in going inside and looking at what was there to display, and some other kind of issues and problems. So I'm not a museum specialist, but there are systems of display, interpretive planning and so on, that the target audience has to be kept in mind while designing the display items.
Yeah, go ahead, and then I'd like to comment on what he said, please.
Will you comment first?
Okay, thanks. For sure, but this is not specifically an Indian problem that we have suddenly young people or even the older ones jumping into a fountain because it's too hot. The way an audience interacts with any museum or memorial, designers across the world, including for Holocaust memorials in Berlin, the very famous, the concrete slabs, have had difficulty keeping off people from partying at that memorial or placing graffiti on it or skateboarding on it. So, because it is, of course, inconsistent with the memorial stands for. My question, and I'll build on this later, that how does your audience respond to the museum and the heritage it projects? But please respond to the earlier one, Julian.
So I'd say that audience attraction into museums is a universal issue we all have to struggle with. And of course, the ideal would be to say that everyone comes and everyone would like to come, and we would put on exhibitions and displays that will attract everyone. And my museum went through a very, well, when Peter was there as well, we went through a very large refurbishment process about 10 years ago. And it was very much a push to go, we must be getting in more and more new audiences, because our current audience is an aging audience, and if we just have them, they will eventually age out and we won't have any audience at all. And the view by the designers was very much that that audience is so committed to our story, because they are people who have been soldiers or have family members who are soldiers, that almost nothing we can do will alienate them. So we must basically, don't worry about them, they're always going to come. Let's just make sure that we get the family audiences and the younger people coming in, and diverse audiences. And I'm here to tell you that you can offend that audience, and they will leave, and they will leave in droves. And when we reopened our museum, we found that we had made several mistakes, and that, in fact, not only were we not attracting the new audiences that we really wanted, we had alienated the audiences that we already had.
Can
So,
you give a concrete example of that?
yes, so we were design-led, and the designers had said to us, one of the issues that you have in your museum is that it's quite technical. There's a lot of jargon. There's all sorts of things like military ranks. And ordinary people coming into the museum do not understand the difference between a captain and a sergeant, or a lieutenant and a corporal. And a few curators like us were sitting there going, if they don't understand that, where else are they going to go to learn that? But it was determined that that was a barrier between the audience and the collection, and that we should not have ranks. So instead of saying Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, we're just going to have Arthur Wellesley. Or we're just going, instead of having Corporal Joe Bloggs, we're just going to have Joe Bloggs. And that was a big mistake, because obviously when the audience that had been familiar with the National Army Museum came back and discovered that those ranks had been removed, they were offended, and rightly so. If a person has earned his rank, he wants to be able to see it on the wall. So yes, that was a design-led error that we were convinced to adopt and that we rapidly had to reverse our position on.
So then what exactly do you think is, or what is the existing relationship of military museums with tourism, or what could it be?
So, I mean, that's a really interesting question, and actually this pivots slightly back to your previous comment about patterns of behaviour and some inadvertent actions by the public when you open to the public that you possibly could predict or might not predict, and things might happen. You know, things. I remember when Pokemon Go became very popular, people wandering in and out of the museum trying to play Pokemon Go, which nobody saw coming, obviously, when we designed it. But coming back to your question about tourism, there is an enduring fascination with war and conflict, and I think that that's because war and conflict allows people to think about ordinary people who accomplish extraordinary things. And you can talk about that without glorifying conflict, and you can talk about how it showcases humanity at its very worst, but also its very best in some cases. And I think what people can respond to is that there are people within that. War is driven by people. It's organized by states, but it's driven by people. And I think that, therefore, when it comes to visiting battlefields and things like that, and museums, there's a fundamental difference between museums that are on battlefields and museums that are not. And the First World War, in particular, an Imperial War Museum, National Army Museums, the RAF Museum, the National Museum of the Royal Navy, are really good examples of this, because fundamentally the main events that we cover happened far away from Britain, and therefore we need to transport people in terms of place as well as time. Whereas if you go to the Somme, if you go to Ypres, if you go to Neuve-Chapelle, if you go to Gallipoli, you are the terrain itself is the witness to the events that you're there to see, and you don't have to create that in the same sort of way. That, however, I think creates a different kinds of sort of sense of a memorial character, and actually significantly, IWM, for example, is not a memorial. We were specifically not a memorial when we were created. We are a museum. You can be a museum and memorial. You can be a memorial museum. But when we were founded in particular, our choice was that we would be a repository of memory. We would collect and interpret people's roles in at that point in the First World War, but we would not memorialize it in that sort of way. And that enables you to, that I think allows you to operate in a certain way in the future. You can be more challenging and interrogative, particularly of problematic history, which allows you to potentially be more inclusive in the present. I mean, history is argument, and we have new arguments about an established past. And if you can interrogate that more, you can ultimately be more inclusive with particularly marginalized communities. But at the same time, if you're not on a battlefield itself, people often don't have that same level of motivation to come and see you.
Yeah. I was interested to ask your experience about, see, military museums can be of wide variety. Are there some particular kinds which the public seem more interested to see, where you find there's a greater response, a greater number of people wanting to come and associate with them, either historical, traditional, modern, ammunition, guns of some kind?
Yes, so across the UK we have 145 about regimental and corps museums, and some of them are extremely large and border on being proto-nationals, and some of them are tiny and in local authority museums and have a couple of cases. I'd say probably the most popular one amongst the regimental museums is definitely the Tank Museum. People like to go and see tanks. And it doesn't matter if the tank's just sitting in a big hall all next to each other, or if most impressively, if they're driving around on a field somewhere, then that's going to be a big draw. They also find that they're a particularly big draw if it's raining, because they're in a county that draws a lot of tourism. And if they can't get on the beach, they're looking for something else to do, then they're going to go to the Tank Museum. So yes, museums that have already, that cover the story of regiments that have captured the imagination already, certainly will draw more. So, for instance, there's a museum called Airborne Assault, which looks at the role of paratroopers since the Second World War. That's going to always be of interest. It's also in another larger Imperial War Museum offshoot that's going to draw more people in as well. If you are in a very traditional, very small, county-based museum that's looking at a story that probably finished in 1958, because that was when the regiment was amalgamated, you're going to struggle a lot more for that kind of, for getting more audiences in. And all museums now in the UK need to get audiences in. There are no free rides anymore. In the past, museums have been supported by the Ministry of Defence exclusively, and that means that if nobody came in through the door, they were still going to be able to get paid and they would still be able to keep their museum open. But that situation is no longer really the case. We all need to be able to convince people to come through the door and actually come and hear the stories that we need to tell.
That is actually provides a really interesting point, because in an increasingly digital age as well, in hyper-digital and with a born digital generation, beyond that, museums still continue to be assessed on their physical footfall. But how museums approach that and how they tackle that as a subject matter, I think, is dependent on each museum. For a long time, digital activity by military museums in particular was seen as being a way to drive physical visitors. And if you weren't driving physical visitors, it wasn't worth the effort. But actually, in fact, as the Imperial War Museum has found, as the Tank Museum particularly has found, yes, by having a very compelling, strong digital offer off platforms such as YouTube in particular, for both ourselves at IWM and the Tank Museum, you'll be reaching people who, in all likelihood, will never come to your museum. But you can also reach an audience from, Mumbai to Manchester, to Massachusetts, to further afield. And if you're engaging people in the digital sphere, then really all you're doing is keeping up with modern technology, because you're still engaging people in the story that you want to tell. And I think that increasingly there's a much closer alignment between acknowledging digital presence and physical footfall that I certainly think maybe 10 years ago there probably wasn't.
I'd also say that some museums are now looking at the digital offer as being their lifeline. Smaller museums that think that they may lose their place and might no longer be able to keep open have created online versions of themselves, which is easy to do when you still have a museum, which means that even if those museums close, those stories are still being told and are still accessible.
I'm just wondering if it's a good idea, in your experience, to combine military museums with other type of attractions, with other kind of museums. We have a national museum here, and there is a gallery there for Mughal period arms and ammunition and things like that. So does a military museum have to be specifically military museum and nothing else? Can you combine it successfully with other kinds of museums?
From my own experience, we create within the National Army Museum about 15 years ago, we created a temporary exhibition which was going to look at children and having a children's experience. And the way that we thought we would do that is to create a temporary kids' creche. So basically, it was ball ponds with pictures on the wall of soldiers from our collection that would be interesting to children. That was so incredibly popular, yes, that we still have that kids' creche there 15 years later. We can't get rid of it because it brings in a huge number of people. It's also an income stream. And for a lot of the people that come into the National Army Museum, they view it as a kids' creche with an inconveniently large museum tacked on the side of it.
Exactly. It's a great revenue generator.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, kind of for your own research, I'd be interested to what you think about combining museums that sometimes have counter processes or purposes. When you're a social museum and you talk about a national story, which is ultimately what these are national stories, then there's a natural fit where it could work. But I suppose the classic historian's answer, mine would be, it depends on what it is that you're presenting and where you find it. So, for example, you could have a single military museum that embodies all three surfaces. In one case, could you do that within a national museum context? Potentially. Could you do it within an event-specific context? Again, potentially. But you're looking at rapidly evolving away, and if you lose a clarity of purpose and vision as a museum, you become confusing as an offer. And if your public offer is confusing, you will most likely struggle.
So there are several things that tied up here. Museums as public spaces, according to the definition, having a specific objective, or at least some of these objectives, meeting some of them. Museums also as places which need to generate revenue, so they need to do certain things to be able to do that. Also the idea of preserving heritage and a message which addresses either a national audience, if it's a national museum, or the Imperial War Museum, for instance. I was just wondering, so the armed forces, if I understand military heritage to be, if I draw a simple connection, that is the heritage of the armed forces, especially in a modern nation state, then that makes a military museum, whether in the capital or in one of the states, very closely associated with the idea of a national heritage. Yeah? What is the space of local heritage in it? The local heritage, and I mean both in your context as well as in the Indian context, that the local heritage may not always be consistent or even agreeing with or even emulating or feeling proud about the national heritage, or vice versa. How do, in your scheme of things, when we are working to, when you say that we should work towards preserving military heritage, and you have a plan for it, and what, in your experience, what are the instances, how do we deal with them? Would you like to go first?
It depends how you convey your understanding of local traditions and military traditions to the public. Not to make it too technical. If one were to talk about, strictly military history, people may not understand. But let's take an example: the Battle of Kurukshetra. How do you convey what happened over there through a museum to the public? I think people would be interested to know. But if you simply were to put up there tanks, an aeroplane, a few guns, okay, it's nice, they'll walk through it once or twice, but they will not probably have the same amount of, they will not be able to relate as well to it as they would to the historical items.
You meant the Battle of Kurukshetra in the Mahabharata context? Okay, I'll come back to that. That's a very interesting point, please.
We have a much simpler job because we're dealing with a network of museums that are based on the regiments that come from those areas. And the regimental experience is pretty similar. I mean, yes, there's going to be, we're not going to deal with them because they're cavalry and we're infantry, and that's always going to be an issue. But I mean, largely that's overcome. But generally speaking, those regimental museums, they speak the same languages, they understand what they're talking about, they've lived through the same experiences, and in many cases, they're talking about the same conflicts. And from having the National Museum in the centre, we're able to set up regional networks that help to assist those. So we at a national centre can offer universal training programs, we can offer advisory services, and we can go out and help to convene those regional networks. Now, I understand the point that you're making, that actually you need to look at those individual local stories. They can do that, but they're also extremely well plugged in to the national networks as well. And I suspect we are in a unique, not a unique, but we are in a privileged position because we are operating with a cap badge system, a regimental system. And so are you. So you are in a similar situation as well. So I would say that's where we are.
Yeah, we see there's a difference between your context and ours. It would seem that in your case, a number of military museums are open to the public.
Yes, a number.
But that is not the case here.
Yes.
Firstly, because most of our military museums are located in cantonment areas.
Yeah.
They are restricted movement areas. If I were to knock on the door of a regimental museum and say, I'd like to come in and have a look at it, they would probably tell me, go get permission from military intelligence.
Yeah.
So it is not open to public. And therefore, a different methodology, a different technique has to be used, how to bring the subject to the people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was very impressed yesterday. One of our colleagues said to me, this is a question about access. And I think that's entirely right. It's a question about access to heritage. But also, I think what you can show is that even if you're doing a local story, you can look at how it has a global impact. We, in particular, Imperial War Museum, we think we tell a global story. We tell it through a British lens, in a British context. We tell ultimately a global story that connects people to world events. And I think that enables you to do it. However, we also operate in a very congested ecosystem in the UK context. There's no sole owner of military heritage within the UK. There are pretenders, I would say, but there's no unified sole owner. But also the idea about how you would centralise it in one place is particularly interesting. I mean, we have 5 sites. They do mostly different things. Our collection is split across them. But at the same time, there's a question about, in a military context, what is the best environment in which to encounter some of these things? Is it to encounter aeroplanes on the ground, or is it in a hangar? Where do you encounter naval heritage, where it's on a ship? Not necessarily in a place landlocked or anything like that. So I think there's some really interesting questions to be asked about the best place you can do this. The problem is, of course, when you're a cap badge system, and you've seen this in the UK, Julian, as you know, if the regiment moves, sometimes the museum gets left behind. And if you lose your regiment and your local connection, that becomes more challenging for you moving forward. I'm not 100% certain there's a single good answer to that conundrum, but it is a conundrum.
I mean, you're absolutely right. If you're looking at the corps, like, for instance, the Royal Army Medical Corps Museum is still at Kehoe, even though the Royal Army Medical Corps themselves have moved up to Lichfield. But, of course, that's not going to impact on the Hampshire Museum, which is in Hampshire, and is going to be dealing with genealogy from Hampshire soldiers' families and so forth. But, yes, that is definitely an issue.
Got it. Thanks, Rana. So we have time. I was just checking on that. No, but all the three panelists seem to have either I didn't articulate my question very well, or you seem to have very effectively skirted the issue.
Oh no, you're on to us.
So let me tell you what I had in mind in the UK context and in the Indian context. So I am rewatching Derry Girls, and the Irish resistance has been very much on my mind. So that's what I meant when I said local versus national.
Oh, I see, yeah. So that in a way is about, so that's a fantastic question, and that is a particularly difficult and challenging issue, as much as anything for both, well, certainly for the Imperial War Museum was targeted by the IRA during the Troubles.
So was the NAM.
So, this is we are acquainted with this history very well.
And you do have some Irish collection.
We certainly do. Historically, within Imperial War Museums, there was actually a real aversion to engaging with that because it's so difficult. That is a conflict in particular that is still live. The absence of violence in that conflict is not necessarily the same as peace, and I think that needs to be remained. And actually, it was only recently the Imperial War Museums confronted that particular issue, but because it's so contested and because it's very much bound up in a whole host of other factors about how you interpret that, it's actually completely fascinating. And one of my colleagues who works with me as the curator of that exhibition discovered that essentially the best way that we could present that was not to try and find a way through the complication, not to try and figure it out for other people, but was just to present the complication itself so people could see it. So, for example, he worked extremely well to gather both sides of this very contested history, to approach it with as much objectivity and neutrality as he could. He built a huge amount of trust with those communities that he would tell those stories in an honest way. And we will present in the exhibition in particular, there's a very unique aspect of it where we talk about this one event that happened in Belfast. And on literally opposing walls, so it's very literal, we have the different sides of this debate that describe this one event in a completely polar opposite way. And the whole point of that is that we don't tell people what to think. We use audio, which is rich with the people's dialects and language themselves. It's their experiences. We convene those just to show people that this is very complicated. And therefore, we ourselves don't always have the answer. And you never surrender the privilege you have of working in a museum, but sometimes you have to surrender the power particularly about being more inclusive.
Yeah, thanks for that. Professor Suri, a similar thing in the Indian context. And let me highlight the case of Punjab. It's an area of interest for me. But also, we know that Punjab is a very proud contributor to India's military history. But in contemporary times, it also has a very complex relationship with the Indian nation state. So this is the conflict I meant. What are your thoughts on it?
I think it's very difficult to have a formula for what should be done in contexts like that. One would have to see the local conditions, the pulse of the situation, as it were. And I would think both are equally important. It's how you mix them together. First of all, find out what it is the people would like to see. Attract them. Probably the local would be more interesting to them to begin with. And then, because this is an iterative process, it's looking at how people react to what you display and adjusting your display with it. And then you find out how much of what they want to see is relevant to your objectives and your theme, and keep on introducing that and improving on it.
A question about the point you raised, and you also touched upon in your presentation, the Battle of Kurukshetra and your reference to Mahabharata. So, before I knew of USI's work, I would have, or in the general discussions in these 2 days, I would have assumed that military heritage is specifically very, very contemporary, very modern. But there have been frequent references from among the speakers that it is also medieval, it is also ancient. And specifically in the Indian case, there has been a reference to the Mahabharata. Where do we distinguish or differentiate between myth and reality, or myth and history? You made a very fine distinction between history and heritage. May I ask you to also think about the distinction between myth and history?
Myth is hugely important in military collections. People think they know all sorts of things about how the British armies work. For instance, if I were to say, why does a British soldier wear a red coat? What would everyone's instant reaction be? Why do we wear the red coat? Somebody tell me why. Why does a British soldier wear a red coat? Yes, sir. It hides the colour of the blood. That's, if you ask people in Britain, why do British soldiers wear red coats? It hides the colour of the blood. No, if you've been hit in the chest with a cannonball, the last thing on your mind is the laundry bill. Nobody cares about that. So that is a myth, and there are many, many, many myths that attach to service, which museums have, I would say a duty, but certainly an obligation to try and break some of the mythology that sits around that.
Yeah, because museums are public spaces, and they're explicitly public spaces, and I think this is the difference between academic history and the way that you present history and heritage within a museum. You have to engage with that. Museums occupy sort of this grey space between objective truth and popular perception. The two don't always match, but nor at the same time can you invite your public in and tell them everything they know is wrong. You can maybe show them why they're not quite correct, but you can't say, hey, come and learn about this. By the way, you're stupid because you think all these wrong things. That's not going to work. And I think that's really significant for how museums have to operate. They have to deal with these sorts of things. But you raise an interesting point about the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. In my view, it almost doesn't matter where they are, because what museums do is museums are explicitly about looking backwards, but actually what they can do is they can provide a toolkit for navigating the present and the future, which means that you can always find enduring relevance in this. And sometimes you need to invite external expertise, external lived experience to challenge you to do that, but you can always reach for those things, and you can always find them within the museum collection, because you're always rooted in the world. And the world may change, of course, but history repeats itself. It doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Myths, it's a very good question, of course, and again, I don't have a clear answer. I would say that myths are an essential part of the military ethos. That if you do away with all the myths, what do you have left? Just technology? What does a man fight for? He fights for an idea, he fights for an ethos. And what, if you go back historically, is the reason for Rome's rise as a military power? 3 simple virtues: frugality, simplicity, and piety. This is all ethos. So I think that you cannot really separate the two. It's how we mix them will again depend on the individual situations.
Maybe we can open up this panel to some comments, some questions from the audience. I see several hands. Rana, you'll be the last. Okay, please.
Okay,
Please use the mic, thanks.
we were discussing about how to get more footfalls. experience that you gain on visiting a museum is what makes the difference. If you're just going to look at objects, artifacts, it's very boring. But you go to the Imperial War Museum, you get an experience of what happens when a gun fires and the shell passes overhead and lands somewhere else. You can experience it. In the same museum, you can experience what you feel when you are under attack and a tank is approaching you. They have different sections, World War I, World War II. They have a different section for Falklands as well. You don't have a section for the Kohima battle. The British historians have declared that the Battle of Kohima is the most ferocious battle of World War II, yet it's not included in the museums. There are other battles, there are lots of other battles which have not been included. And Indian and British soldiers have fought together in most of those battles. Similarly, if you go to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, you can experience the landing of an aircraft on an aircraft carrier. You can feel it. You can look at a wall, a drawing on the wall, a panel, which is indicative of bombers flying overhead during World War II. It gives you a real feeling. In the Imperial War Museum, I saw grandfathers...
Briefly, sir, please. Briefly, thanks.
I saw grandfathers explaining various aspects of battle to their grandchildren. Now, if I wanted to explain any aspect of battle to my grandson, and I don't have the access to a museum, then I find it very difficult to explain the larger picture of war to him. I can talk about my experience, but how did that whole war go through is only possible in a museum. So it is when you think about all this that you begin to develop a concept which actually delivers. The Edinburgh Museum, for example, is boring as compared to the museums we find in London.
Well, some of the London museums are also boring and tiring. Museums in general are boring and tiring, I would say, as a... I mean, it's not specifically...
I feel
addressed as you.
attacked by
No,
that.
no, 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 please don't. I altered my statement.
If I could say so, I think one of the things that you hit on, because you use this word about 4 times in your question, is the word feel. And actually, engaging public emotionally as well as intellectually is incredibly important, because the stories that we're all trying to tell are immensely emotive. We only have to listen to General Cardoza to be moved if you listen to the sort of stories that he will tell you. And it's exactly the same for us. We are trying to engage people on an emotional level as well. I'm glad that the Imperial War Museum succeeded.
Should we take a few comments and questions? Yeah? Rana, please. And who else? Anyone else wanted to? Yes, you please, and then you. Yeah, please. Rana, the gentleman here, and then the lady there.
I'm not the last, thank God. So, a question for you. You mentioned in your suggested outline, proposal, you said a plan. Now, what's the difference between why not a policy and why plan? That's my question. The framework that we wish to present for developing the military heritage sector, you talked about presenting a plan as opposed to a policy framework. So that's a question for you. For my colleagues from the IWM and the NAM, what are your thoughts on objects/artifacts versus tech solutions, and in the same line, e-museums and digital existence of museum walkthroughs? To what extent is a museum built around a physical artifact as opposed to a digital recreation of one? So that's it.
Yes. See, the way I look at it, the policies are what you would like to do, and how you would like to do it. You have some objectives in mind. But then there should be some end products in mind, deliverables, target dates. In 1 year, we wish to accomplish this. In 2 years, we wish to be here. In 3 years, we want to be able to do so many things. So how will that be worked out? Some sort of idea should be there, otherwise everything will be in the air. Some target dates, like you have, and then there will be feedback, monitoring, adjustment, because things will not go completely smoothly.
Suggest one thing, I'll take a second. A plan is what you want to do. A policy is how you want to do it.
Yes.
On the question of sort of the physical versus the digital, museums remain a physical experience that people go to. People go to a museum to see the physical relics of something that connects them to either the past, the story, a specialist subject. You know, you go to see dinosaurs because you like dinosaurs. You can read about dinosaurs on Wikipedia, or you can go to a museum and see a dinosaur skeleton. So they remain a physical experience that digital can complement, it can augment, sometimes it can substitute, but it can never replace within a museum context. That's personally my opinion. I feel like digital access enables you to do a lot. Digital tools enable you to do a lot about opening up access, about engaging people in heritage. But then you get down to sort of a difference slightly between different types of collection, different collection types. Visual media, for example, if you see visual media in a museum, you see visual media online. That's slightly different to seeing a 3D object, for sure, for being in the presence of something. Because ultimately, that's what happens. When things enter a museum's collection, they effectively gain a sanctity, even if sometimes that is, well, if you ever go through the back catalogues of various museums, you question why some people ever accessioned various things. A bench from the old museum was accessioned in IWM, for example. I can't imagine why. So, you know, as I was saying earlier, collections aren't infallible. Coming back to your question and points, thank you very much for visiting. You're quite right. We talk about experiences, but what we're very aware of as well is that you cannot replicate that experience without being it. It is a unique experience that is only shared by people who are in that situation. So we have to be very careful about how we try and do that. And we have to do it in an ethical way, and we have to be very conscious of our own limitations. We always do that, particularly in the UK context, from a place of far greater safety than the people whose stories we share experienced. And so it could be quite challenging without either making it too gamified or making it voyeuristic. So it's quite challenging. But also on the subject of Imphal and Kohima, it's not in the museum as much as it should be, but it is there. We have some wonderful artifacts relating to it. Perhaps not as many displayed as we should, and that's perhaps where, coming back to Professor Suri's point about how you need to change displays to give people reasons to come back or respond to what they say. But when you're looking at, well, we look at a century of conflict. You look at 350 years of conflict. You are effectively, quite literally, picking your battles about what you put on display. It doesn't mean you always need to be wedded to those. And I very much take your point that perhaps there needs to be time where we go focus. But that's where special exhibitions and additional programming comes in. We have an exhibition coming up in 2027 about Indian soldiers fighting in Britain's wars, not from the perspective of this is what British people thought about it, but from what they thought about it. So we can look to address some of those things for sure through additional specialist activity like that.
Yeah. Go on. All I was going to say was the point that you make about interactives, Rana, you can have incredibly effective digital interactives, electronic interactives. You'd better have a good maintenance plan with them because they will break inevitably. The primary duty of museums is to preserve our heritage. That's the point. You can't tell your story without the objects. But I'll go as far as into heresy as to say there's no point in having those objects if they don't tell the story. So,
or you don't let people see them.
Or yeah, well, exactly that too. Yes, the objects that we have help us tell the stories of British, in my case, soldiers, airmen, and sailors, and the people in the wider Commonwealth and Imperial armies that fought under the British flag. That's the point: is to tell those stories, and we preserve the objects to allow us to do that.
Thank you.
Julian, just very quickly and light-heartedly, but to join the dots and finish the myth about the red cloth. I think I know the answer, but if it wasn't for the dry cleaning bill...
Why are we in red coats?
Yeah.
Because when the Army of Parliament was being put together, the new model army was the first formalised army that Britain ever had. Parliament wanted to put them into a uniform. They happened to be sitting on a lot of cheap red cloth. It was in parliamentary warehouses in London. If they'd had a lot of cheap blue cloth, we could have been the thin azure line ever since.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a conservation architect, and my question is not specifically to your museum objects, but how military museums can address the process of reducing the number of wars in the world. And I think we need to understand how to change the mindset. And in India, most of the military cantonments we have are very large. And they actually need to respond to the ecological aspects of those cantonments. Some of them have trees like camphor planted like maybe 70, 80 years ago. And there is so much more to the heritage which is related to military, but it has to be interpreted in relation to the people who are going to use it today. Because what we find is this single-minded approach of using military heritage only to talk about battles, wars, and, literally blood and death, rather than to find a way to use the military heritage to get peace in the world and to look at the spaces which were used for, military establishments to be put to some use which is like, which educates human beings to be more human.
I should think there are at least two questions there, if not three. One is about how the military heritage or what exists in cantonments can be used to bring peace. That's a different matter. It's a socio-political issue. As far as the heritage itself is concerned, I touched on it in my introductory speech that there are different kinds of heritage. It's not just museums or buildings. There are also spatial patterns. There is also trees. There are also rivulets, streams, hills. They're all part of the heritage. And all of this has got a value for conservation as precincts. We are very much behind in the conservation of precincts. I should think in Maharashtra they have made some regulations. In Ahmedabad there are quite a few regulations. I don't see much happening in North India. And this is an important part of history, as conservation architects will appreciate. But this problem is going to get even more complex now, because when we talk about, as government has announced, the separation of civil and military areas in cantonments. So what impact will that have on the heritage which you have over there? Can you really divide heritage into this is civilian and that is military? At least not the management will become very complicated, because they were conceived as single enclaves. They were not conceived as separate areas. So it's not just a management problem, it's also a design problem.
Would you like to respond to? Give us an example in English.
Well, there aren't that many examples. So military establishments in the past were built, so Victorian barracks were inside towns. Generally speaking, most soldiers are now quartered outside and in much larger structures away from towns. There are a few things like regimental headquarters that might still stay within towns, but they're not really impacting massively upon the local ecology or any of that sort of. You have a point.
No, only to say that in the UK context, until 2019, the majority of the UK army, in particular, had always been stationed overseas. So we were effectively somebody else's problem.
So we have cantonments and we have amazing waterworks and, the technology, the way technology was used to run a whole, the cantonment was literally a mini city.
Yes, and exactly the same thing as of garrisons in Germany, for example, even in the later 20th century. What's interesting is since the army left Germany, in that context, the casernes have been turned into a whole manner of things. They've been turned to science parks, the new Rathaus in the town of Celle in Niedersachsen. It was an old British Army barracks. One is a school, the old headquarters of the British forces, the British Army of the Rhine, 1 BR Corps. They are other things have been turned to Bundeswehr barracks, the German Defence Force as well. I think from the UK context, the most interesting context I can think of is in northeast France and in Belgium, where the past is very visible, but it's sometimes a challenge about having the past constrain the future. If populations are building, you need more houses, people need more homes. Are you going to preserve every square foot of field because there was a battle on it? Or are you going to honour those people and commemorate that in different ways, but also serve the needs of people in the present? I say this as someone who once led a battlefield tour on a site, on an industrial estate, on an astroturf, trying to convince people about the very significant historic event that had happened there. So, there are different ways of approaching it.
All right, they have started to dismantle the furniture outside. I think it's time for us to wrap up. Thank you very much,
my
panelists and the audiences. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It was a lovely panel, and I think we got some laughs also after the very, very serious sessions. Thank you once again, and we'd like to present you with a token of appreciation. Thank you. And can we have a photograph, no? Yeah, all 4. Photograph, no? हो गया इनका? Photograph.